Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplanty Goodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion, which you might be able to see around me and behind me. It's tropical houseplants. Now, the plant that I wanted to talk about today is very suitably behind me. This has come back in from its summer outside. So this plant, for those who might not know, is the Hoya Linearis. And you can see, I think the best comment that I ever got from anybody about this plant was a very dear friend who's not really into plants, and it's just like, oh, I really like it. It looks like hair. And it really does kind of have that hanging basket look to it as well. It's definitely one of these plants that I'm always a proponent of. If something is trailing and is kind of a plant that you would put up and it would trail down, I usually like to stake things up so they can grow up, because most plants, when you give it something to grow up, the leaves will start maturing more and things like that, because in nature they would be growing. The reason why they're trailing is they're scrambling across maybe the forest floor, and then they'd hit a tree and then grow up, and then that's when they start maturing. This, however, is not one of those plants. This is a true trailer, at least in my eyes, because in nature it grows in this kind of pendulous kind of growth habit, where essentially it will cascade down from branches. Very similar, if I'm not mistaken, to Spanish moss, the tillandsia that kind of grows off the side of trees. That isn't something that will ever grow up. It will always hang down, essentially. And you can see that the leaves are kind of made for that as well. The interesting thing about the leaves of the Hoya Linearis is that most Hoyas have got quite succulent leaves. This does have relatively succulent leaves. It's got a really interesting leaf structure, because it kind of almost has a bit of a midrib, and there's the leaf matter that grows around that midriff, but it kind of almost encompasses it. It's really interesting. And yes, it's relatively stiff, but it's not as succulent as the majority of the other Hoyas. This is also really, really soft to the touch. It's got a slight velvety touch, and I'm trying to see if I can maybe show you. I don't think this is probably going to come up in the camera. I'll see if I can get a picture, because this is not particularly easy to move. Actually, let me try, because I've recently repotted this whole thing, and I'm really hoping it's going to take well into pon. It was in soil properly. The thing to know about the Linearis, unlike other Hoyas, is yes, it does like to dry out a bit, but this is also a Hoya that doesn't mind staying a bit more moist for a bit longer. Let me see if I can bring that peduncle in, and if I hopefully cover my face, it will focus on that and not my face. So you might be able to see, and the peduncle grows downwards like the rest of the plant. Let me put it back, because I've done my usual trick and I decided to do a video on a plant that I have just watered this morning, so everything is dripping. But for the people that have been here for a while, I still haven't learned. It's fine. But this is a plant that, for me, in terms of Hoya, is probably relatively easily it's actually one of the easiest Hoyas to grow, in my experience, in my environment. Now, I know some people struggle when they start this off in smaller cuttings. I know in America, I don't know if that's changed. In the US, do let me know in the comments down below, but I know for a while this was a particularly difficult Hoya to come around. I think there's more of them around, and there's more mature versions of them around, and they're not that expensive anymore. So people don't have to propagate from a two-leaf cutting, essentially. And let me show you actually a propagation that I did from this almost a year and a half, maybe coming up to 2 years ago now. That was probably one of the first few videos that I did. I don't know if I did it on here. I think I might have done it on my Instagram account. If you're not already following me on my Instagram, it's at TrojanKing9. And the link is down below in the description. And if you really want to know why it is what it is, do ask me, send me a DM on Instagram, and I will let you know. Right, let me show you what the propagation of this looks like now. And that started as a two-leaf cutting, essentially. So a few of the two-leaf cuttings you can see here, they have grown quite nicely. And I am so super thrilled to say that even this has got a little peduncle that is about to bloom, and hopefully that was focusing. But actually, no, there's a second peduncle as well. Very exciting. Now, the thing with this is, and I knew full well when I was doing this, I've also just repotted this from soil into leca. The thing to be aware of, not just for the Linearis, and I'm really hoping that for this Linearis and for some of the other Hoyas, the other Hoyas seem to be doing all right at the moment, that they won't skip a beat, but they're very, very sensitive to drastic changes, things like changing their soil out or their growing media. They're very similar to orchids in that respect. So an orchid, if you do too much to it, if you change its growing media, same with the Hoyas, they can throw a bit of a wobbly and then just abort the blooms, basically. So they'll drop the peduncle entirely. And generally with my Hoya Linearis, this is the second year that it's about to flower. And I have to say that it's around this time last year as well that I did it. So in the UK, in September time is when I get this generally to bloom for me. Now, it might have something to do with the way that I've been growing this one, but considering that the cutting is doing the same thing at the same time, maybe it isn't what I thought it was. So what I thought it was originally is that this Hoya for the last 2 years now has summered outside under a tree usually, so it doesn't get scorching bright light all day long, but it summers outdoors. It goes through storms, through all the summer storms as well, and it's doing really well. But it seems to really like being outside. The one other good thing that has happened with this, and hopefully you remember when you saw the cuttings, the node space, the internodal space, so between each one of the two leaf couplings was quite long. On this, even though I've had this plant for nearly 3-4 years now, it's not particularly long, so it doesn't go much lower than what you're seeing on your screen right now, but the internodal space is very, very short. And I think that has started happening the more I take it outside. So it's not stretching, it's not etiolating itself to get more light, which is etiolation in other plants that you might be used to is something, it's a scientific term basically. So if you've got something against the window and it starts leaning towards the light, it's etiolating towards the light. So that's why they always suggest that you rotate your plants so that they keep more of a columnar and upright structure, so they're not always leaning towards the light, so it's not always facing in the same direction. With this, it's really interesting because of the way that it hangs. You wouldn't necessarily assume that that's what it would do, because at the end of the day, it's going away from the light. It's always going away from the light. But it is really interesting to see that even this plant, when it comes to the internodal space, when you give it a bit more light, it will become a bit more compact. So it's much more compact around the lower bits. Obviously, the top bits still had the longer internodal spaces. So it's quite bushy down below, but maybe not as bushy up the top, because I got it and it was already relatively long. It was probably about here when I first got it. So yeah, a very, very cool plant. It doesn't need any special level of humidity, I don't find. It also is one of these plants that, for me, I have always found that as long as I give it that summer outside underneath the tree, which you might think is bright indirect light, but in relation to bright indirect light in the house, that is probably closer to bright light. As long as I give it that period to really kind of soak up that light, it seems to do okay in medium or indoor bright indirect light. It doesn't need the same level of scorching direct light that I give my other Hoyas indoors. And again, I will always caveat this to say this has been my experience in my situation in the UK where I'm growing, where even in the summer, southern exposure windows don't get as much sun as you might assume, especially if you're in a nice, warm, sunny country. Even in the summer, it's a bit more diffuse here, because even in the summer, guess what? We get clouds. So yeah, I think that's most of what I want to say about this plant. In terms of care, as I said, I've moved it over to pond now, as a lot of my Hoyas, because every Hoya that I've moved to pond so far has done spectacularly. So I'm hoping this will do the same thing. But before I was growing it in light airy aroid soil mix, it's doing fine. As I said, I don't let this go entirely dry before I watered it, because I know this one does like not to be kept moist like you might get with a calathea or a fern, but it does like a bit more moisture. It's a similar situation to the Hoya polynera, which is the fishtail Hoya, which I've also got, and it's also laden with peduncles. I'm looking at it, it's directly in front of me behind the camera. But that's another one that's similar to this. That one really does throw a hissy fit if it gets too dry. So it's kind of a bit of a balancing act. This one is a bit more forgiving, and this is probably why you're seeing this come out a bit more readily at the moment. It is not a particularly fast-growing Hoya, but what Hoya really is. And yeah, I think that's it. Fertilize as you would with any other of your house plants for needs every second or third watering. And yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say about this. If you've got any questions, comments, do drop them down below. I'd love to have that conversation with you as always. We're building a nice little community in the comments and people are kind of exchanging some of their own experiences as well, which is fantastic. So yeah, I think that's all. Hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly hope that you have a great, great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.